Good evening. Welcome to the Monday night program. We have quite a treat in store for you all this evening. Our guest is the author of Searching for Stonewall Jackson, A Quest for Legacy in a Divided America. He's brought a few extra copies of his book along with him if anybody would be interested. One review that I read of this book said that it is a strikingly original take on the Confederate Army and the modern South. Another review said it was a thrillingly vivid portrait of a soldier, a war, and a country still coming to grips with its past. Our guest has a master's degree in English from UVA, and he has a wealth of experience in teaching creative writing and English at both the secondary level and also college. So I'm not going to keep you all waiting any longer. Let's give a real big welcome to Ben Cleary.
How's everybody tonight? Very good. All right. Early in the last decade, I wrote some articles for the New York Times Disunion series. Microphone. All right, here we go. Several of my pieces that I wrote for the New York Times were found by this New York editor, Sean Desmond, who asked me to do a book on Stonewall Jackson. It was a dream opportunity for someone who'd been fascinated with the war, and especially Jackson, for more than 3 decades. When I started, interest in Confederate military history was viewed as quaint, a pastime pursued by elderly ancestor worshipers and those slightly demented people who dress up in wool uniforms to play war in the summer heat. Then there was Charleston, then Charlottesville. The Confederacy became anathema, a pawn in the culture wars. The idea that historical personalities should be considered in the context of their own time was not to be considered. For months, according to my late wife, my writing became joyless and defensive. It's a mark of the strength of my material that I was able to pull out of my reactive funk and deliver a good book. In the end, I was left with the conviction that people from the past deserve understanding rather than condemnation. If I had approached Jackson as a one-dimensional symbol rather than a multifaceted human being, I would never have gotten to better know one of the most fascinating people in American history. My book took longer to write than it did to fight the war. During those years, I found Jackson to be a gift that keeps on giving. I never exhausted him as a topic, and he just became more interesting. After I finished, mysteries remain. With my publication receding in the rearview mirror, I can definitely say that I'm still searching for Stonewall Jackson. The most intriguing and important question for which I'm still searching for an answer: why wasn't Jackson afraid of death? As a rule, Civil War generals led from the front. Historian James McPherson, in his monumental study of the Civil War era, Battle Cry of Freedom, notes that the chances of generals being killed in combat were 50% higher than those of privates. As with almost everything else, Jackson took this to the extreme. To the horror of his subordinates, he was almost always in the hottest part of the fight. Antietam was the bloodiest day in American history. Jackson presided over the morning's fighting, the bloodiest part of the bloodiest day. The cornfield, I'm talking about this battle up in Maryland called Antietam. The cornfield was at the heart of that morning's battle. One unit who fought there, the Texas Brigade, suffered a shocking 82.5% casualties, the greatest loss suffered by any infantry regiment north or south during the war. According to one battle history, it was later estimated that the opposing lines surged back and forth across the cornfield no fewer than 15 times in the course of that fateful day. But after things quieted down in his sector, Jackson was still spoiling for a fight. In spite of the savagery of the fighting and the numbers engaged, Jackson told his brother-in-law, D.H. Hill, that he never felt safer in battle than at Antietam. He felt that God would protect him and that no harm would befall him. That security, said D.H. Hill, extended to him throughout the day. Sometimes Jackson's soldiers believed that just being near him, we all know the story about the woman who touched the hem of Jesus' garment and the healing went out. Well, the men would sometimes just try to be near him, thinking that he would protect them, just his presence would protect them. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, a soldier named Williamson witnessed Jackson praying and decided that just being in his vicinity would bring him a blessing. I saw him raise his hand, he wrote later, and the expression on his face and the gesture so impressed me that I rode on behind him saying to myself, I will get the benefit of that prayer. Another reason he raised his hand, he thought that he was not only probably the most brave person in American history, he was also the most eccentric. So he thought that one side of his body was heavier than the other. Don't ask me why. But he said if he raised his hand, that would balance the forces in his body. So one time he was at Manassas, and he raised his hand like that, and a bullet went through one of his fingers. So he paid the price. When he was in the Mexican War, he behaved essentially the same. This was before he became a Presbyterian and started believing in predestination and all those good things. At one point, he was during the fight outside of the Battle of Chapultepec, a cannonball went between his legs, but he kept fighting, and he also tried to become a Roman Catholic at that time, and he went and interviewed the Bishop of Mexico. So that I would love to have been a fly on the wall to hear Stonewall Jackson discussing religion with the Bishop of Mexico. And one of the reasons that I'm attracted to Jackson is because he wasn't afraid of death at all. I'm terrified of dying. I don't want to die. And he was also a soldier, and he made his life obeying orders. And I've spent most of my life trying to avoid getting people to tell me what to do. So it's a case of opposites attract. Jackson prayed constantly. He had said he'd never raise a glass of water to his lips without giving thanks for the water of life. He sometimes prayed aloud while walking through the woods. He lived in a far more religious age than ours, and he was far more religious than practically anyone in that pious time. And some people said that they could gauge the severity of a coming battle by the amount of time that Jackson spent on his knees in prayer in his tent before the battle happened. His servant, Jim Lewis, would say, "Hush, the general is praying," and nearby soldiers would respectfully fall silent. The other thing, he had a real belief in the Sabbath that's way outdistances anything we have today. He wouldn't write or read a personal letter on Sunday. And he said that the Confederacy was doomed at one point because they had Sunday delivery of the mails. So he thought that God would punish the Confederacy for that. So he was really, really brave, really, really religious, but more than anything else, he was really, really secretive. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit with the secret life of Stonewall Jackson. And that is the general. Most people familiar with the war know that Stonewall Jackson was a master of military secrecy. One of his most famous quotes began, "Always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy." He had established habits of secrecy long before the Civil War. His early life was so tragic and painful, and his internal life so unique, that he kept much of it a secret, sometimes even from himself. The need for secrecy in wartime is obvious. Everybody's trying to find out. Well, we think about the spy balloon that came over this week, so we're still at it. In the Confederacy, people were especially hungry for military news. Information could affect friends, neighbors, loved ones, even your own home. Keeping secrets was very difficult because everyone was so eager to find out what was going on. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnson relates a story from February of 1862. After a top secret Confederate conference with Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, Johnson left and went to his hotel in Richmond. There he found that people in the lobby were already talking about what he had been discussing at the meeting. The news had traveled across Richmond faster than he had walked to his hotel. Stonewall Jackson was probably the most secretive commander of the war. If his soldiers were marching, he wouldn't tell them where they were going. He'd just post a man at each crossroads, and the only thing the man was allowed to do was point the way. He couldn't answer any questions. He couldn't say anything. Just go that way. He seldom shared his plans with his generals. When Lee and Davis were thinking of extending the Valley campaign, they sent Jackson reinforcements under General Chase Whiting. After his troops arrived in the valley, Whiting rode 15 additional miles to confer with Jackson. He returned furious, complaining because Jackson had told him nothing about his plans. General Whiting, he didn't say one word about his plans. I believe he hasn't any more sense than my horse. And then Lee summoned Jackson to Richmond to help in the fight against McClellan right after this, and Jackson ordered Whiting to return. So this guy took all his men up to the Shenandoah Valley, and as soon as he got there, Jackson wouldn't tell him anything, and then he sent them all back the next day. So didn't I tell you he was a fool, and doesn't this prove it? Well, I just came through Gordonsville the day before yesterday. And General Ewell said about Jackson's secrecy, he told me in confidence that he admired his genius, but he was certain of his lunacy. And he never saw one of Jackson's couriers approach without expecting an order to assault the North Pole. There was no happy medium with Jackson. He took secrecy to the extreme. There are many cases when his generals would have performed better if they had known where they were going or what they were supposed to do, and maybe even why they were doing it. Still, he had so much drive and determination, not to mention military talent, that he was almost always successful. He at Chancellorsville, where he was killed by his own men, he took 30,000 men on a flank march all around the Union Army, and they kept saying, they kept reporting it, and they said, oh no, they couldn't be doing that. That can't be true. He can't be doing that. So, and they eventually defeated General Joseph Hooker there. Ironically, he suffered death at the height of his fame when he was mortally wounded by his own soldiers during the battle. Jackson accepted his fate and would not have been surprised by it. A man of deep religious faith, he also had a tragic sense of life. We are all children of suffering and sorrow in this world, he wrote his pastor. Events in his own life had led him to this conclusion. So he's really, really eccentric, but when you look at his life, you can see just why he became that way. He had so much trauma and so many stressful things and so much tragedy that you can just go into his mind and see exactly what he was talking about, why he was that way. Jackson's father and sister died of typhoid fever when he was 2. His mother following a difficult childbirth when he was 6. He lost his brother Warren at 17. He was mostly raised by an uncle Cummins Jackson, who was arrested for counterfeiting, escaped from jail, went west, and died in the gold rush of 1849. For most of his life, he was very close to his sister Laura. Unfortunately, they say that Laura looked almost exactly like a female version of Jackson. So the war drove a wedge between them, and they never saw each other after its outbreak. A staunch Unionist, she expressed mixed feelings following his death in 1863. This is his first wife, and she gave birth to a stillborn child, and she died shortly thereafter. They really pull their hair violently. You can see the part that they've gotten here. Jackson married his second wife, Marianna Morrison, in 1857. The couple was extremely happy and devoted, but their first child, a daughter, lived less than a month. So he lost his first wife, his first child, his second child. And he responded to all these hardships with work. He graduated from West Point. He started out close to the bottom of his class, and he kept working his way up through the class ranking. And they said if it had been a 5-year program instead of a 4-year, he would have been at the head of his class. He also sought solace in religion, becoming a devout Presbyterian. He had a host of ailments. He was partially deaf. He was an artillery instructor at VMI. That probably explains that. And he talked about how one side of his body he thought was heavier than the other. And he had indigestion and or what they called dyspepsia back then. And the way he wanted to cure that was he prescribed himself a diet of stale bread and water. And he refused to think about what was happening to him. He only revealed his early tragedies to a select few, notably to his second wife, Anna. If he did acknowledge his personal misfortunes, he thought of them as having a higher purpose. His favorite Bible verse was Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God. So if you can think of somebody who has the power of positive thinking so deeply embedded in their being that they can think that all these tragedies, dead children, dead parents, etc., were working together for good, then you've got Stonewall Jackson. It's led to some gaps in his self-knowledge. During the Romney campaign, he was a lifelong teetotaler, and he never drank wine, beer, and particularly not whiskey. But while he was on the march during the winter of 1861, he got chilled, and Dr. Hunter McGuire recommended that he drink some brandy. And Jackson said, "Oh, doctor, yes, if you say, tell me to do that, of course I'll drink some brandy." But he had never drunk brandy before, so he drank a big glass of brandy, and then he got out on the march again, and he opened his jacket, he said, and he started mopping his brow, and he said, "I've never known how it got so warm so fast." He relentlessly, now the one thing that the biggest mystery of Jackson's life was what he did right around us here when he fought in the 7 Days battles. He was an incredible general, but he constantly underperformed. There's a house called Laurel Meadow about a mile from here on Lee Davis Road, and Jackson had not slept for days and days, and his men camped all around that area where the vegetable stand is, if you know that on over there by the well, anyway, that's where his men camped. They say that it took all day for so many men. It took all day for them to come down the road. At White Oak Swamp, he fell asleep with a biscuit between his teeth. So he just lost it, and he had the chance at Laurel Meadow to get some sleep. but he just kept driving himself and stayed up all night writing dispatches. So he didn't have to do it. Lee went to bed at 11 every night during the 7 days battles. Jackson, not so. He got so little sleep that it clouded his judgment, becoming so tired that he didn't know he was tired. But he also lacked self-knowledge about some other things. One evening in 1852, he went to see his friend, D.H. Hill, and the two usually discussed religion, but on this night, Jackson couldn't stop talking about Eleanor Junkin. "I don't know what has changed," he said. "I used to think her plain, but now her face seems to me all sweetness." Hill laughed. "You're in love, that's what's the matter." So he didn't realize he was in love. So he took his friend to tell him. Jackson gave the matter serious thought. I don't think there was any other kind of thought with him. He concluded that he must be in love and started courting Ellie. But the course of true love never does run smooth. Ellie's sister Maggie opposed the match. Simply put, her sister was her best friend, and she didn't want to lose her. So Ellie broke off the engagement. According to D.H. Hill, Jackson was completely heartbroken. I don't think I ever saw anyone suffer so much. He kept saying to me, "I think it is probable that I shall become a missionary and die in some foreign land." After 3 months, Ellie relented. The couple decided to keep their engagement secret, of course, from all but the immediate family. They were wed in 1853. The people of Lexington did not know about the wedding until the couple left on their honeymoon. And Maggie accompanied them on the trip. We've talked about Jackson as a master of military secrecy, as well as a man whose personal tragedy made him extremely secretive and private. But the greatest secret of all in relation to Stonewall Jackson is the man himself. He was an eccentric teacher at VMI. James Bud Robertson, who Dr. Cook knows well, said that he was probably the worst teacher in the history of the institution. If they asked him a question about anything he was teaching, he'd stop, back up about 5 sentences, and just repeat what he had said. So he was a terrible teacher. But he later became one of the best generals in American history. And Robertson said that the soldiers, the young men at VMI, laughed at him in one decade and died for him in the next. So that's kind of him on his secrecy. Are there any questions up to this point? Any thoughts, any observations? How are we doing for time? I can't see the clock there. Okay, I'm gonna read you some things about a few things, and y'all be thinking of something to ask me or confront me with, or shake your fist up at the podium and say, "You're completely wrong, sir." This is about growing up right about 2 miles from here, over on Rural Point Road. If y'all go down that way, I grew up there, and my grandfather had a house there since the 1950s. And I didn't know anything about the Civil War. He didn't know anything about the Civil War, but it kind of just sort of ambushed me. One day in the early 1970s, I helped my grandfather dig a cherry stump out of his front field. The tree had been gone for years, but the resilient wood of the stump survived, and he was tired of plowing around it. I was down in the hole, hacking at roots with a grubbing hoe, when I found the rusted blade of a shovel. What was it doing there, 3 feet down and 30 feet from the road? Did somebody die on the march and a grave-digging soldier leave it when he broke his handle? I wish Granddaddy had saved it. He saved tons of useless stuff, a lot of which I still have, but he didn't save that. A lost object with an unknown story, it surfaces in my mind sometimes when I walk up to the road and think about Jackson marching by, that column that took all day to pass right outside here. There are so many body stories. Most recently, a man from my church told me about a former neighbor who had unearthed a Confederate some years ago in the subdivision on the far side of Totopotomoy Creek, less than a mile from my house and a little farther along Jackson's route of march. If y'all know where Pole Green Church is, this is a subdivision that's across the road and somewhat to the north from that. They were digging a ditch to pour a concrete footing for a garage when they broke through a coffin and saw a pair of feet. The cement truck was on the way, and they didn't have the time and perhaps not the inclination to disinter the body. So they pushed the feet back up out of the way and continued with their project. The man from my church has since moved, still in Hanover County. He relocated to another battlefield, Hawes Shop. I have 2 graves on my property now, he said to me, matter-of-factly. They're everywhere. So when you're out there in your little community garden digging with your, just be aware. And I used to work for the Parks. There was a gentleman who talked to me who used to work for the Park Service, Ron. Yeah. So I also used to work for the Park Service, and people would just come in with these incredible stories. You know, they had about things that happened, and we'd chat over there at the Cole Harbor Visitor Center about how they'd gotten interested in the war. And there was a guy who drove a truck, and every time he'd bring his truck and he'd go through the little battlefield tour road. I just helped you with your landscaping, said the trucker, laughing. The park road is really not much more than a paved trail, and when he drove his rig through, it ripped off branches. He told me he was from Baltimore and that he had always stopped by after he dropped off his load. Anything new, he asked, glancing at the books and maps for sale in the shelter. Not really, I answered. He looked over the exhibits, then walked to the desk. We chatted, then he told me he had a room in his house full of books and paintings devoted to the Civil War. How'd you get interested in this stuff, I asked. I had a dream when I was 6 or 7. I was lying on a battlefield, wounded, pretending I was dead. A Confederate officer rode up on his horse. He knew I was faking. He stabbed me with his bayonet. The trucker shivered. I had that dream over and over. I can still feel the cold steel going in. One day, this is another story that still kind of amazes me. One day, a woman came into the shelter saying she was just going back to visit Mama. I thought she was talking about using the park road to get to a small cluster of houses on the other side. Then she asked me about putting up a plaque. I assumed it was for an ancestor who had fought there. It turned out to be for her mother. She was a good old Southern lady, really into the Civil War and reenacting. She told us, when I die, just sing Dixie and scatter my ashes in that old Confederate trench at Cole Harbor. So that's what we did. And I'll just read, so there was a story about some of the visitors. I think the thing I did differently in the book was I wrote about going to the places, actually going to these battlefields and what it's like to go there. So this is about a soldier who was wounded out at Malvern Hill, and somebody was telling me they have a person who was just turned 100 who lived at Malvern Hill, one of your co-residents. Okay, so I was, so anyway, this is a story from that area. We're moving down south and east from where we are. Willis Church was a Union hospital after the Battle of Glendale, then a Confederate hospital after Malvern Hill. Confederate J.P. Jordan wound up there after Glendale. His story is emblematic of the sufferings of many of the wounded of both sides. It also has some darkly comic turns that make it stick in the mind. First, Jordan's hip was bruised when his canteen and haversack were shot away. Then his collarbone was broken by a musket ball. Trying to get back to safety, he was shot again through the foot. I then threw away my knapsack and gun and tried to get away on one leg, but had gone only a short distance when a voice called, "Surrender!" And I promptly did. My captor was a good-natured Irishman who kindly gave me permission to ride on his back. The Irishman carried him to his regiment. Moving afterward to the yard of Willis Church, Johnson met a federal surgeon who tried to frighten him by brandishing some of his instruments and threatening amputation. The doctor then apologized, sort of, by saying that he had heard that Confederate soldiers never got frightened. Wrote Jordan, I told him that he had a Confederate soldier there who was worse scared than he had ever been in his life. He was then interrogated by General Fitzjohn Porter, who expressed regret that he was probably dying, and added that since he was, he should have no compunction about answering questions. I had no intention of dying at the time, wrote the soldier, and no intention of telling him the truth. After misleading Porter, he was approached by a federal nurse who wanted to desert and asked him for his help. Jordan said he would gladly help if he would give him some water. The canteen the nurse brought him was the first drink he had had since he was shot. When rain threatened, the nurse found Jordan a place inside the church. He got no sleep that night because a federal officer whose nose had been shot off and was very angry spent the entire night walking up and down the aisles of the church, wishing for a Confederate soldier on whom he could vent his wrath. The light was dim, however, and Jordan's so-called uniform was so dirty that he couldn't tell whether it was blue or gray. So that was a little taste of what some of the soldiers went through. Any questions or observations or anything? Yes, sir.
You had the opportunity to visit Guinea Station?
Yes, it was called the Stonewall Jackson Shrine, and now it's called the Stonewall Jackson Death Site. So I guess it's but I had it's a very spooky, very moody place, and every time it seems to be raining. Every time I go there for some reason. So, have you been there often?
I've been there once and it was spooky, as you say. To be alone in that room, you can feel things.
Well, I think they still have a clock there that's like the clock that was ticking when Jackson died. And the best, I think one of the best things about Jackson was his exit line. He had probably the best exit line in American history. He said, "Let us cross over the river and rest in the shade of the trees." Any other thoughts? Or yes, ma'am.
Just by chance that a couple days ago I picked up at our library a very thick book about Stonewall Jackson. It's over 500 pages, and I'm working my way through it, and it's the most interesting. I would usually not pick up a book about war, but it's just fascinating.
Well, he had a big life, outside of war too. So I mean, there's so much color and so many interesting things about his life. He went on after his first wife died, he went on a European tour, and he didn't go to any battlefields. He just went to cathedrals and church sites. So I mean, I went to Trinity Wall Street in New York. Researching the book because he had gone there on his honeymoon with his first wife, and they had gone up in the belfry and looked out over what was then rural New York, and of course now it's nothing but buildings and buildings and buildings. But he had an idea. He knew exactly what he was getting into when he went to war against the North, because it was they had so many more men, so many more railroads, so much more factories, so much more everything. And he knew it because he had lived in the North, and he knew exactly what he was getting into. Okay. Dr. Cook, you have anything? Any thoughts? Okay. Well, thank y'all so much. Y'all are a wonderful audience. I really appreciate you.
Up. Okay. Thank you everyone for coming again and have a good night.